Te Dakota, Te Wharo, o Auckland Unitarians. Te Dakota, nā manahuri, no mai, higher mai ki tere whare karakia a te atua, Te Dakota, te tato katoa. We welcome you into this circle of community. If you are a first-time visitor, you might wonder why Auckland Unitarians have come to this sacred space for 117 now, 117 years, as of today, actually. We come because in a world ravaged by violence, by hatred, by conflicts that seem eternal and insoluble, sometimes the only thing we can do is be still for a moment to remind ourselves what is real. The sun that rose this morning, the dirt under our feet, the air whispering in and out of our lungs. This hour, try just to be present in each moment as it unfolds. Your simple attention is what makes these moments holy. Following the postlude, the service invites you into a time of hospitality at morning tea. It's our sacrament of hospitality. It won't be complete without you. Now let us move into worship, willing to be authentic with each other, honest within ourselves, and open to connection in all its forms. The New York Times has a columnist that is definitely more conservative than I am. His name is David Brooks. And he's a Republican at heart, but he's kind of given up on the Republicans. But this is a portion of a column he wrote that I agreed with very much. Forgive its American slant. I think some of it still applies to us. In this country, we're raised to go for the gusto, to try new things and savor the smorgasbord of life's possibilities. As Oliver Wendell Holmes put it, the chief work of civilization is just that it makes the means of living more complex. Because more complex and intense intellectual efforts mean a fuller and richer life. This striving for fullness and variety has always sparked a counter impulse towards simplicity and naturalness. Henry David Thoreau made a fervent protest out of simplicity. Most Americans lead lives of quiet desperation, he argued. On the other hand, as you simplify your life, the laws of the universe will be simpler. Solitude will not be solitude. Poverty will not be poverty, nor weakness, weakness. Today's most obvious simplicity impulse is the movement to declutter the home, cleaning out the closets, and paring down the wardrobe has become a religious ritual for many. A search for serenity, a blow against stress, and a longing for a beauty that is found by pruning away what is not. Today, simplicity movements are not as philosophically explicit as older ones. The Puritans were stripping away the material for a closer contact with God. Thoreau was stripping away on behalf of a radical philosophy. It's easy to see what today's simplifiers are throwing away. It's not always clear what they are for. It's not always explicit what rightly directed life they envision. Still, there's clearly some process of discovery here. Early in life, you choose your identity by getting things. But later in an affluent life, you discover or update your identity by throwing away what is no longer useful, true, and beautiful. That's an excuse in identity discovery and exercise in realizing and then prioritizing your current tastes and beliefs. People who do that may instinctively be seeking higher forms of pruning, being impeccable with your words, parsimonious but strong with your commitments, disciplined about your time, selective about your friendships, moving generally from fragmentation towards unity of purpose. There's an enviable emotional tranquility at the end of the road. In a world of rampant materialism and manifold opportunities, many people these days are apparently learning who they are by choosing what they can do without. Lighting the chalice seems simple enough, but without a candle, wick, or lighter, it would not blaze. I light this chalice to remind us that living simply requires community. Sometimes, when I publish the title of a future sermon, I wish I'd spend more time thinking it through first, and not when I'm trying to write it. This is definitely one of those occasions. The more I thought about simplicity, the more I realized living simply isn't simple. It may not even be possible or always that desirable. I went blindly down this path because of my attachment to the song we just sang. 'Tis a gift to be simple. It was one of my mother's favorites, and I chose it for her funeral service. She thought of herself as simple, but that should have been a red flag. In truth, she was a very complex person. Like her, simplicity may be a gift, but if viewed only at face value, we will not fully appreciate it until we unwrap it. Henry David Thoreau. Now, don't let your eyes glaze over. This is important. Henry David Thoreau was also a complex person with a complex life. But he's best known for his book, Walden, A Paean to Simplicity. In it, he describes the 2 years he spent living in a rustic cabin on Walden Pond. Catherine Schultz was not impressed. In her critique of Thoreau in a New Yorker article, she entitled Pond Scum. She considered him narcissistic, pinched and selfish, as parochial as he was egotistical, and an inexorable writer whose best remembered work is unnavigable and fundamentally adolescent. Such talk about one of our heroes. She's obviously not a Unitarian. Schultz goes on to say, Thoreau did not live as he described, and no ethical principle is emptier than one that does not apply to its author. The hypocrisy is not that Thoreau aspired to solitude and self-sufficiency, but kept going home for cookies and company. That's just the gap between aspiration and execution. Plus the variability in our needs and moods from one moment to the next, eminently human experiences, which, had Thoreau engaged with them, would have made for a far more interesting and useful book. The hypocrisy is that Thoreau lived a complicated life, but pretended to live a simple one. Worse, he preached at others to live as he did not, while berating them for their own compromises and complexities. Ooh, ouch. Sandy Stott, editor of a blog called Thoreau Farm, won't surprise you that she rebuts Schultz by asking, but really, did Thoreau claim to live a simple life? He aspired to simplify, to make good choices, but he never claimed that he led a simple life overall. His point that he had other lives to live after his Walden experiment aims in that direction. Thoreau was endlessly complex, and he knew it. He had a global awareness before it was fashionable to admit such. But he also knew that complexity must be balanced by the drive to simplify, to get at what's meaningful in a world where we can be buried in drifts of information and yearning. Excuse me. I think his experiment revealed that there is something within us that resists simplicity. 'Tis a gift we are tempted to re-gift. Maybe someone else can use it. Unitarian minister and blogger Gretchen Haley suggests that simplicity isn't the problem, but our resistance to it. Her mentors taught her not to resist the resistance. To do so only makes us dig in our heels. Every minister eventually figures this out. To resist those in their congregation resisting a new vision or direction is counterproductive. Resistance is a time to listen and to try and understand. Don't resist the resistance can also be applied to individuals, particularly in spiritual practices. In meditation, for example, you might find yourself resisting the practice, the quiet, the breath work, whatever. Rather than resisting this resistance, the helpful practice is to explore the resistance itself, to remain curious about inner tensions or judgments. Then the resistance simply becomes a part of the experience, allowing you to more fully participate in the moment itself. I think Thoreau's Walden Pond experiment was consciously or unconsciously his way of exploring resistance to simplicity. In her book, Your Money or Your Life, Vicki Rubin tells the story of two novice Zen monks arguing about whose master was more evolved. One claimed that his teacher was so powerful that he could stand on one bank of a river and write his name in the sand on the other shore. That's nothing, the second one said. When my master is hungry, he eats. And when he's tired, he sleeps. And with that, the second one won the debate. We laugh, but really, how many of us sleep whenever we are tired? Or eat when and only when we are truly hungry? Something in us resists this simple logic. We read books about health and happiness, research and attempt many different formulas. But really, there is this simple formula that would probably go a long way. Sleep when you're tired and eat when you're hungry. But we resist and go looking for a more complicated answer. I'm grateful to the Reverend Haley for opening my eyes to another aspect of simplicity. It is not to everyone's benefit. She refers to liberation ethicist Miguel de la Torre, who offers one possible explanation for our resistance. In his book, Doing Christian Ethics from the Margins, de la Torre questions the value that traditional religion has placed on simplicity, arguing that values of selflessness and humility were established by those with privilege. As he says, those who formulated these dominant ethical precepts may have wrestled with the prideful sin of self-centeredness, but the marginalized have instead suffered from a lack of self-identity. The traditional religious values of simplicity or selflessness have been used as tools of oppression for women, the poor, and people of color. Rather than lifting up continued simplicity or bending and bowing, de la Torre says a more liberating message would be to encourage a stronger selfhood, dignity, and self-worth. And so perhaps our resistance comes from an acknowledgement that simplicity is not always a good thing. Definitely not a good thing for everyone, particularly not those who have not chosen it, but rather have had it thrust upon them by way of poverty or racism or other marginalizing forces. There is a big difference between voluntary simplicity and involuntary poverty. Haley bolsters her argument by referring to an article by John Yema in the Christian Science Monitor. People in subsistence cultures rarely see simplicity as desirable. They hunger for more food, cleaner water, better schools, greater access to electricity, healthcare, transportation. Won't affluence and choice make their lives more complicated? Yes, please. He goes on to remind us that Thoreau, a model of simplicity, relied on an underlying complexity. He could always stroll into town for a warm meal for Mom and a chat with his pals. Whereas we often lift up the saying, live simply so others may simply live, Yema points out that individual simplicity sometimes depends on a whole network of others' people's willingness to provide a great deal of responsibility and complexity so we can. Now, I'd like to call all of this stuff I've been talking about so far mostly intellectual resistance. But there's something less analytical, more intuitive. That is an even bigger source of my resistance to simplicity. It's the resistance that shows up when I try to put it into practice in real life, some new habits of simplicity. It's the resistance that acknowledges this isn't easy. For one thing, complexity, busyness, acquisition of stuff and ideas, these come by way of effort. And we like efforting. It is self-rewarding. We work hard, we feel good. We work hard, we feel our worth. But simplifying requires we live into what principle we say we affirm, our inherent worth. That has nothing to do with how much stuff we have, how much work or to-dos we get done, how much we know, how much we help or care for others, or even how many hours of volunteering we put in. Simplicity requires a deep trust of our inherent worth that is there regardless of any of these things. And secondly, there's a certain habit to having and doing a lot. It's hard to change habit. Changing these sorts of habits can mean upending years of ways of being, changing the energy in you and in the way you interact with your friends, family, and coworkers. Simplifying requires new habits, difficult habits, like saying no immediately. Saying no, even to things that might be fun to do or to have, even to people who you might love and cherish. It means acknowledging your limits and knowing that the only way to say yes to your most important yes of life is to say no to nearly everything else. Paulo Coelho, a Brazilian author that is ranked second of 200 most influential contemporary authors, made this point brilliantly in his popular novel, The Alchemist. He tells of a young lad sent by his father to a wise man to discover the secret of happiness. The wise man lived in a magnificent, faraway castle, complete with sweet music, beautiful artwork, delicious food, and sprawling gardens. It was a wonder of the world. After a long journey to the castle and waiting for hours to speak to the sage, the boy finally gained an audience. The wise man listened to the boy's explanation for his visit, then answered, I do not have time to reveal the secret of happiness to you. Instead, he handed the boy a teaspoon with 2 tiny drops of oil in it and instructed him to wander around the castle for 2 hours without spilling the oil. The lad did as instructed, carefully climbing the high stairwells and creeping down the long hallways of the palace, his eyes always fixed on the teaspoon. When he returned to the wise man, he was asked, "Did you see my Persian tapestries, my extravagant gardens, my parchments in the library?" Embarrassed, the boy replied that he had not. He had been focused solely on the drops of oil in the spoon. With this confession, the boy was sent back to tour the castle, and this time he focused all his attention on the beauty that surrounded him. He returned to the wise man with excitement, thrilled at all he had seen. The wise man then asked, "And where are the 2 drops of oil I gave you?" The boy realized he had spilt them along the way. The wise man then revealed his secret to happiness. Happiness lies in looking at all the wonders of the world and never forgetting the 2 drops of oil in the spoon. This parabolic story calls for a much-needed balance. Joy is the product of being in tune with the world around us, while caring for the few precious things we have been given to carry on our journey. We cannot ignore the realities of our surroundings, and we cannot ignore our personal responsibilities. But the real brains of Coelho's story is that the wise man gave the boy only 2 drops to carry in a spoon. Not a quart of oil, not a 5-liter bucket full, and certainly not a heavy back-breaking tank of the stuff. It was only a couple of drops, revealing that happiness is maintained by keeping our personal load as light as possible. Do you want to be happy? Lighten your load and simplify your life. The most deeply spiritual thing that some of us could do is have a garage sale or a bric-a-brac sale. Purge our calendars. Resign from a few of our many activities. None that are here at the church, though. Our happiness isn't related to a poor prayer life, the lack of reading the Holy Writ, or going to church too little. We are carrying too much baggage. We are trying to manage too much stuff. We have too many possessions, too many obligations, and too many batons juggling in the air. This is an unqualified recipe for misery, because all of these weights and concerns of life, most of which we have assumed, they have not been thrust upon us, are choking out any real chance of being happy, as we simply cannot carry our self-loaded burdens or lift our needs, or lift our heads to see the beauty around us. None of us can live our lives, worship the divine, enjoy the world, or take care of those who have been given to us to love. These are a few of the priceless drops in the spoon, by the way. If we are constantly looking at our shoelaces, burdened with ourselves and our many concerns. Thus, when we simplify, we're doing much more than getting rid of physical possessions or conserving our precious time. We are sharpening our emotional focus. We are making spiritual space. We are choosing to be happy. To be happy. Happiness, after all, is an intentional choice. And it is the wisest choice of all. Amen. The following meditation is by Doug Kraft. Doug and I were mates when he was the minister of the Unitarian Universalist Society of Sacramento, and I was the administrator. He was the first to encourage me to retread my Episcopal ordination and become a Unitarian minister. So I was pleased when I found this meditation by him that emphasizes our point today. Doug says, when I was a kid, I liked to skip stones on lakes. If I threw a flat stone at the correct angle and with enough speed and energy, it would kiss the surface and leap into the air again and again. If we have too much stuff in our lives, our attention skips from one object to another without really enjoying anything. If we have too many activities, our attention jumps from past to future without settling into the present. If we have too many opinions, we end up thinking about how things should be without fully seeing how things are. Happiness and ease flow from the bottom of the lake. They aren't found hopping over the surface of life. We have to slow down enough to settle into the depth. Joy and ease are simple and uncomplicated. Having lots of things to do, stuff to manage, places to go, and opinions to consult make life complicated. Practices that cultivate simplicity do two things. One, they reduce the amount of stuff, activities, or preferences, so we have a better chance of settling into the present. They get the outward to resonate a little better with the happiness, joy, and ease in our depths. And two, they help us become more aware of our relationship to stuff, experience, and thought. Go forth in simplicity. Find and walk the path that leads to compassion and wisdom, that leads to happiness, peace, and ease. Welcome the stranger and open your heart to a world in need of healing. Be courageous before the forces of hate. Hold and embody a vision of the common good that serves the needs of all people.